My car died at 9:12 p.m. on a stretch of Route 16 that had no business being so dark, and the only light I could see in any direction was a neon sign a quarter mile ahead that said the last stop. Vacancy. The V going out and coming back like a slow heartbeat. I walked to it because I had no other options. I took the job for the same reason. The fog had come in around Millfield, which wasn't even a town so much as a suggestion of one. A gas station that had stopped being a gas station. A grain elevator with no grain. A water tower with a name nobody had bothered to repaint. I'd been driving through it when the engine made a sound like something swallowing wrong and then quit. I coasted to the shoulder, sat there for 3 minutes waiting for another car. Nothing passed. The trees on both sides pressed close, and the fog sat between them like it had always lived there, and I was the one intruding. I had $43 and a dead phone, and a duffel bag with 2 changes of clothes, and a resume that had gotten me nowhere in 4 months. I had been driving nowhere in particular, which had turned out to be somewhere after all. I got out. I started walking. The gravel crunched under my boots, and the fog moved around me slowly and indifferently. The sign got bigger as I walked. The last stop. Below it, white lettering on a black marquee. Open 24 hours. Home cooking. Good coffee. A chrome and glass door set into a chrome and glass facade, the whole building a relic of a time when diners were supposed to look like the future. Red neon tubing framed the windows. A help wanted card was taped inside the glass, hand-lettered, ink slightly faded. I pushed the door open and went in. The smell hit me first, coffee and bacon grease and something underneath both, faintly mineral and old, like turned earth after rain. Black and white checkered tile floor, worn to gray at the traffic areas. Red vinyl booths along the left wall, cracked at the seams, patched with electrical tape at the corners. A counter ran the length of the right wall with chrome stools bolted at even intervals. At the far end of the room, in the farthest corner, was a booth set slightly apart from the others. The overhead light above it was dimmer than the rest. But that wasn't the thing that made me not want to look at it for long. The thing was the quality of the darkness itself, the way it sat there thicker than the light warranted, the way standing too close to a road's edge gives you a bad feeling before your brain finishes the thought. I looked away and kept moving. A jukebox stood against the wall between 2 booths, unplugged. The cord coiled on the floor beside it, not connected to anything. It was playing something low and slow that I couldn't quite catch the tune of. I filed that away and moved on, because I was standing in a diner at 9:15 with $43 to my name, and my car dead on the shoulder outside, and a jukebox with a motivation problem was not my priority. One customer. An old man at the counter, working through a piece of pie with focused, systematic energy. He didn't look up when I came in. A woman came through the back door, 70s, silver hair that sat perfectly still, rhinestone cat-eye glasses, a pale blue diner uniform with a name tag that said Mabel. She looked at me for 2 seconds, cataloged whatever she needed, and said, "You the one whose car died on 16? "Yeah, I don't have cell service, I was wondering. "Landline's in the back. Won't do you much good tonight. Donnie from the garage won't come out past 8. She reached under the counter and came up with a folded uniform, white shirt, black apron, black pants, and set it in front of me. "You cook?" "Line cook, 6 years. "Good. Night shift is 10 to 6. I'll pay you for tonight in cash at the end of the shift. Keep the position if you want it, 12 an hour plus the tip jar." She said all of it in the tone of someone reading from a memorized list. "Change in the back. One more thing." She reached under the counter again and slid a laminated card across to me. "Read that before you start." I picked it up. 15 items, numbered, plain font. At the top, house rules, night shift staff. At the bottom, breaking any of these rules may result in termination of employment and other consequences beyond management's control. I read through it once, then again more slowly. Rules about greetings, about names, about rain customers, about silverware left on the floor, about a booth in the corner, about a phone that only got answered on 3 rings, about not following customers into the parking lot. that one last, and underlined. I set the card down. "These are specific," I said. "They are," Mabel said. "The booth 13 thing." "Yes." "The 7 minutes with the dropped silverware." "Correct." "Not following anyone outside under any circumstances." "That one is not a preference. That one is a condition of employment." She looked at me over the rhinestone frames. "You've worked restaurants. You know every kitchen has its own rhythm. These are mine. They've kept this diner running 62 years. She paused for exactly 1 beat. "The staff who followed them are all still here or retired in good health." I did not ask about the others. I picked up the uniform. The cook was already in the kitchen when I came back out in my whites. I hadn't heard him arrive. He was in his 50s, military straight posture, face creased deep, standing at the grill with one hand on the counter edge, looking at nothing. He looked at me when I came through the pass-through and gave one nod. Name tag said Eddie. "Ryan?" I said. He nodded again. He turned back to the grill. I went out front, refilled the old man's coffee. He thanked me without looking up, finished his pie, laid a 5 on the counter, and walked to the door. I watched him cross the parking lot toward a truck in the far corner. The fog was thick out there, the truck's edges already soft and uncertain in the murk. He got maybe 10 feet into the lot, and then the fog thickened around the truck specifically, and then the truck and the man both wavered once, the way a reflection wavers when you drop something in still water, and then they were gone. Not drove away gone. Not walked into the trees gone. Just gone, the way a light switches off. I stood at the window for a moment. Then I decided the fog on Route 16 was very thick and the lot lighting was poor, and I had just started a new job and had not eaten since noon. I went to refill the salt shakers because Rule 13 said to keep them full, and it cost me nothing. At 10 past 10, the front door opened. She was dry. It had been raining for 20 minutes. A steady, rural rain, no wind, coming straight down. The parking lot outside was dark and wet and gleaming under the red neon. She walked through the front door without an umbrella, without a raincoat, and she was completely dry. Not recently dried. Dry the way you are when you haven't been outside at all. She was, I tried to describe her later, lying in a motel room on I-70, and the best I could manage was assembled correctly with a margin of error I couldn't locate. The features were there and in the right places. The proportions were right. But there was a stillness to her face that went deeper than calm, and when she looked at me, the color of her eyes was something I didn't have a name for. Not blue, not gray, not green. Something between all three that doesn't exist in the places I've been to. The kind of color that appears on a paint chip but doesn't translate to real light. She sat at the counter. I set a menu down and said, "Welcome to the last stop. What can I get you tonight?" Rule 1. I'd read it 3 times. She looked at the menu without really reading it. Then she looked up and said, "Ryan?" I went still. I looked down at my apron. No name tag. I hadn't been given one, hadn't asked for one, hadn't said my name to anyone except Mabel in the back room. The old man had left before I'd said 2 words to him. She said my name the way you say a word you've known for a long time, not reading it off anything, not trying it out, just saying it the way you'd say the name of a street you grew up on. "What can I get you tonight?" I said. My voice came out even. I was quietly proud of that. She ordered coffee, black. She asked about pie and I told her we had apple, and she said she'd think about it. She sat with her hands around the mug without drinking, just holding it, the way you hold something warm when you've been cold a long time and aren't ready to do anything yet except register the warmth. She looked out at the rain. I went to the far end of the counter and wiped it down and ran through every possible way she could know my name and came up empty. I thought about asking Mabel. I decided Mabel had given me 15 laminated rules and would tell me what she thought I needed to know and nothing more. The woman left after 40 minutes, set a 20 next to her mostly full mug, and walked out into the rain, and she was still dry when she pushed through the door. I went to clear her cup and noticed the coffee was still warm. Not a mug holds heat warm, drinking temperature warm, like it had just been poured. I rinsed it and put it on the drying rack and found something else to focus on. At 11:10, a man came in. Middle-aged, beige jacket, the nondescript of someone who has been traveling a long time and stopped caring how he looks. He sat in a booth, second from the door, not booth 13, I checked. He ordered the burger and a Coke. Eddie had it up in 8 minutes. The man ate quietly. He didn't ask what year it was, which I was grateful for because I'd read Rule 6 and wasn't confident I could say "does it matter" with a straight face on the first attempt. He finished, came to the counter, paid, pocketed his change, picked up his jacket, said, "Thanks." I said, "Of course." He went to the door, pushed it open, and stopped. He turned around, patted his jacket pockets front and back, and looked at me with the mild, embarrassed expression of someone who's misplaced something small. "I think I left my wallet," he said. "In the booth. You mind coming to check?" I was already moving. 6 years of restaurant muscle memory. Customer thinks they left something, you go help them look. I had my hand on the pass-through counter halfway around it, and then a voice came through the kitchen window. Flat, no particular inflection, like a weather reading. "He didn't leave anything." Eddie, not appearing at the window. Just his voice, landing in the room between me and the door. I stopped. I looked at the man. The expression had dropped off his face. Not into something threatening, not into anything I could name, just into neutral, the way a face goes when there's no longer a reason to hold a performance. He looked at me for a long moment from across the diner. Then he nodded once, slowly, and walked out the door. I watched him cross the parking lot. He made it about halfway to where a car would have been, and then the fog took him the same way it had taken the old man. One moment there, the next moment the fog was a solid gray wall, with nothing shaped like a man in it. I stood at the counter, then I took out the laminated card and read Rule 15 again. Never follow a customer outside, not for any reason. The diner's protection ends at the threshold. The last employee who crossed it didn't make it to her car. I read it twice. The last sentence a third time. I put the card back in my apron pocket. I went behind the counter. I checked the salt shakers. I refilled the one at the far end anyway, because it was something to do with my hands, and my hands needed something to do. The jukebox kept playing, still unplugged. I didn't mention it to anyone. I stood behind the counter with the rain hitting the windows and the neon throwing red light across the wet parking lot in long, wavering streaks, and the parking lot empty in all directions. And I thought about the woman who'd known my name, and the man who'd dissolved before he cleared the lot, and Eddie's voice coming through the pass-through at exactly the right second. I was a line cook from Columbus with no current address and $43 and a dead car on the shoulder outside. There was nothing on the other side of the door right now except dark and fog and a long walk to nowhere. The rules were strange, the strangest thing I'd ever been handed in a workplace, but every rule I'd seen come up in the last 90 minutes had mattered in a way I couldn't explain and wasn't going to try to. I was going to follow them, all 15, all night. I read the card start to finish one more time, slowly, the way you read something when you want to actually know it and not just be familiar with the shape of the words. Every rule. I thought about each one. I put it away. The rain came down harder outside. The red neon turned the water on the windows into something that looked briefly like something else, and then just looked like rain. I went to make a fresh pot of coffee. I had the feeling I was going to need it before the night was done. The rain was fully committed by 11:30. Not the tentative kind that starts and stops. This was the settled, serious kind that had decided it was going to be here for a while. It came straight down out of a sky with no light in it anywhere, hitting the roof of the last stop in a low, constant roar that I felt in my back teeth after 20 minutes. I had refilled every salt shaker. I had wiped down the counter twice. I had made 2 fresh pots of coffee. I had read the laminated card again in the back hallway under the fluorescent light, thumb running down all 15 items, and I had thought about the man whose face had gone neutral before he walked out and dissolved, and I had decided that whatever this place was, I was going to follow every rule on the card for the rest of the night and think about what I'd seen after I was somewhere else. The problem was I had nowhere else to be until Donnie from the garage showed up at dawn. So I stood behind the counter and I waited, and at 11:42 the front door opened. She was dry. I'd half expected it after the woman from earlier, but half expecting something doesn't fully prepare you for it. She was in her 40s, or had been, wearing a tan trench coat with wide lapels, unmistakably 1940s in cut. Her hair was dark and set in the style of that era. She looked completely solid, every detail present and accounted for, except for her pupils. They were too large, not dilated in low light large the way a pupil looks in a photograph taken with the wrong flash, covering almost the entire iris so that the color underneath was just a thin ring around the dark. Rule 3. Rain customers first. They've been traveling longer. I came around the counter. "Welcome to the last stop. What can I get you tonight?" I gestured to the nearest booth. She sat. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them before looking up at me. Her expression was tired in a way that went past the tired you get from a long drive. I took her order, coffee, scrambled eggs, and I did not ask her name and she did not offer one. Eddie had the eggs up in 6 minutes. I brought them out. She didn't touch either. Rule 4. Untouched order after 5 minutes. Replace it without comment. The warmth is what matters, not the food. I watched the clock. At 5 minutes and 14 seconds, I went back, picked up the plate without a word, and handed it to Eddie through the pass-through. He set a fresh one down without being asked. I brought it out. Her coffee was still full. I topped it off anyway. She wrapped both hands around the mug. That was all. Just held it. The door opened again before I got back to the counter. A family. 3 of them. The father was in hiking gear, the real kind, good quality. He would have looked solid and capable in a doorway except for the angle of his neck, which was wrong. Not grotesquely wrong. Just a few degrees off from where a neck should sit, the way a picture hangs slightly crooked and you keep noticing it. The mother was behind him, eyes open, fixed on a point well past the wall in front of her. No visible injury on either of them. Their son was between them, 7 or 8 years old, looking completely and straightforwardly normal. Bright eyes, a gap in his front teeth, one sneaker with a Velcro strap that had come undone. He looked around the diner with the open curiosity of a kid who finds everything worth looking at. Rule 3. I came around the counter. I seated the parents in a booth and the boy at the counter on the second stool from the left, because Rule 11 said children alone at the counter, never a booth. He climbed up and studied the menu with great seriousness. "Can I have a cheeseburger?" he said. "Hot chocolate coming right up," I said. I made it and put in exactly 7 marshmallows, counting each one out, because the rule said exactly 7, and I was not going to be the person who got that wrong tonight. I brought it out. He pointed to each marshmallow in turn, counting under his breath, then looked up and smiled. A completely regular kid's smile. 7. That's my lucky number. "Good," I said. "Enjoy." I took the parents' order, coffee and pie, and brought it out. Neither of them touched it. I set the mental clock for 5 minutes. The door opened again. An elderly man in a wool sweater and corduroy trousers, moving with a careful, deliberate step. When he sat down, his feet didn't quite reach the floor. Not couldn't reach. Didn't reach. Hanging just a fraction of an inch above the tile, the way an object hangs in the moment before gravity finishes deciding. 8 customers now, all dry, all arrived through rain that had not touched any of them. I moved, refilled coffee that wasn't being drunk, checked the salt, all full, wiped the counter, kept busy because keeping busy was the only thing that was helping. Then the boy said, "We fell." He said it the way kids sometimes say things out of nowhere, picking up a thread that had been running inside his head without you being part of it. "My dad was trying to take a picture at the overlook and he stepped back and there wasn't any more ground. And we all..." He made a small gesture with his hand, palm down, dipping forward. "At Wildcat Hollow. That's the state park." He added this helpfully, as though the context was the part that mattered. I stood there with the coffee pot in my hand and said nothing. "The hot chocolate is really good," he said. He picked up the mug and drank some of it. "It's warm. "I'm glad," I said. My voice came out even. I didn't know how. I went back behind the counter and stood there for a moment, then checked the salt shakers again because they were already full and I needed something to do with my hands. At 12:43, I heard whispering from the men's room. Low and multiple, the way voices sound when several people are talking quietly in a small space. Not frightened, not urgent, just present in a room that had nobody in it. Rule 8. I walked to the back, stood in front of the door, knocked 3 times, the way you knock when you want someone to know you're there and aren't coming in. Then I walked away, back to the counter. I waited. The whispering continued for 12 minutes. I counted. At 12:55, it stopped. Eddie's voice came through the pass-through. "Good call." I looked at the opening. "What's in there?" A beat of quiet, then, "People who missed the dining room." I thought about that. "They're all in transit," I said. "Aren't they? Everyone in this room." Another pause. "This is where they stop," Eddie said. "For what?" "Same reason anyone stops at a diner." He didn't say it like it was comforting. He said it like it was a fact. I stood there for a moment. Then I went back to the floor because there was coffee to refill and salt to check, and that was the job. At 1:08, I dropped a fork. I was clearing a booth, stacking plates, and the fork slid off the edge and hit the floor, and I had my hand halfway down before I remembered. Rule 9. Leave it 7 minutes. I straightened up, left it there on the checkered tile. Went back to the counter and watched the clock until exactly 7 minutes had passed, then returned and picked it up. The floor where it had fallen was faintly warm. Not hot, just warm, the way a surface gets when something has been resting on it. The fork itself was room temperature metal, just the floor. I put it in the bus bin. I didn't mention it to anyone. At 1:20, I was doing my 4th refill on the trenchcoat woman's coffee, untouched, replacing her eggs for the 3rd time, when she said quietly, not quite to me, "The little one doesn't know yet." She was watching the family in booth 4. Something in her expression was gentle in a way I didn't expect and couldn't quite handle. I set the fresh plate down without a word and went back to the counter. At 1:30, a blurry customer came in. Rule 10. I found it before I finished processing what I was seeing. Blurry customers. Serve them normally. Do not stare. He was blurry the way a photograph is when the subject moved during the exposure. Edges soft, features present but not resolved. His clothes, the suggestion of clothes, shaped like a man. He sat in a booth, looked at the menu. I went over, said the greeting, took his order. His voice was slightly imprecise, like hearing something through a wall. Understandable, but with something off in the texture of it. I brought his coffee out. His hands wrapped around the mug were more solid than the rest of him, more present, more resolved. The warmth, I thought. That's what does it. I went back behind the counter and stood in the low roar of the rain, and I understood what the diner was. Not dramatically, not all at once. It came the way understanding comes when you've been looking at something from the wrong angle and then you shift slightly and the whole shape resolves. A stop, a waypoint. The rule about warmth mattering more than the food, the rule about seating rain customers first because they'd been traveling longer, the rule about not asking names. It all made a different kind of sense now. The rules weren't about running a restaurant. They were about the people who stopped here and what they needed to make the stopping bearable. I stood there with that for a moment. Then I refilled the salt shakers. All of them. At 1:47, the wall phone rang. 1 ring. I watched it. 2 rings. I set the cloth down. 3 rings. I picked up. Last stop. The voice sounded like water moving through old pipes. Present, understandable, but wrong in the texture of it. Is there room still? For 7 who've been on the road a very long time. I said nothing. Rule 12. Listen. They'll arrive before the rain stops, it said. Then silence. I hung up. I walked to the pass-through. 7 more coming, before the rain stops. Eddie looked up from the grill. He nodded, He turned, opened the lower cabinet, and started pulling plates. He was already counting them before I'd finished the sentence. I went back out front, checked the open booths. Enough room. Checked the salt. And then, scanning the room the way you scan a floor when you're working it, just taking inventory, not looking at anything specific. My eyes moved left to right and reached the far corner a half second before I managed to redirect them. The darkness in booth 13 was different from the darkness in the rest of the room. Not darker. Different. It had a weight to it, a quality that a shadow or a dimmed light simply doesn't have. Like whatever that darkness was, it was aware of the room in a way that a darkness shouldn't be. I looked away. Fast. Back to the counter, the coffee pot, the clock on the wall reading 1:53. I did not look at that corner again. 7 more were coming, and I had tables to set and salt to keep full. And the card in my apron pocket had kept this diner running for 62 years, and I was going to follow every item on it until dawn. The rain came down. The jukebox played something slow that I still couldn't name. The boy at the counter finished his hot chocolate and asked, very politely, if he could have another. I made him one. 7 marshmallows. I counted every single one. The 7 arrived at 2:14. I heard the door and turned, and there they were. 7 people filling the entrance in a loose group, not bunched together the way strangers wait in a doorway, but spread out the way people move when they've been walking for a long time, and the habit of keeping space between themselves and others has worn away. They were dressed across decades, a woman in a gray wool coat that belonged to some time in the 70s, 2 men in work clothes, the kind with the permanent crease lines of something worn often and washed often. An older couple, the woman clutching a small purse with both hands, the man with his cap held in front of him, the way men used to hold their hats when they came inside somewhere. A younger man who might have been in his late 20s, in jeans and a flannel shirt, looking at the floor. A woman in her 40s with dark hair pinned back, who looked up and found me immediately. They were all dry. They were all quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable silence, but something more worn down than that. The quiet of people who have been a long time in motion and have stopped talking because talking takes energy they no longer have to spare. I came around the counter. I seated them. Rule 3. They'd been traveling longer than anyone. 2 booths and 3 counter stools spread the way the room allowed. I said the greeting to each one, set menus down, didn't ask names. I took their orders one by one. Coffee down the line, a few plates here and there. The man with the cap ordered the hot beef sandwich. The woman with the purse ordered toast. The younger man in flannel didn't look at the menu at all. He just said quietly, "Coffee," and went back to looking at the table. I put every order through the pass-through. Eddie worked steadily without comment, the way he'd worked all night. I kept moving. I checked the salt at every table. All full, all good. I replaced cold plates from the earlier crowd without a word. The diner was fuller now than it had been at any point tonight. Every booth occupied, most of the counter stools taken, the hum of the rain still going on the roof, though I thought it had eased a little since midnight. At 2:45, I replaced the trenchcoat woman's eggs for what must have been the 5th time. She was still just holding the coffee mug. She hadn't moved from that position in over 3 hours. I set the fresh plate down and she looked up at me briefly, and something in her expression was, I don't have a better word for it, grateful. Not the kind of grateful you get from a good meal. Something quieter. Something that had nothing to do with the eggs. The diner had a different quality now than it had at the start of the night, when I'd stood here with one old man and thought the rules were the elaborate superstitions of a woman who'd been alone too long. That version of things was gone. I knew what was in the room with me. I knew what the warmth was for and why the food didn't matter and why the rules about names existed. I wasn't rattled the way I'd been at midnight. I was past that. I was working. That was all I had left. At 3:29, I went behind the counter for a fresh pot of coffee, and my hand knocked the edge of something that shouldn't have been there. A folded piece of paper, tucked under the register, weighted down by the corner of the base. I picked it up. Mabel's handwriting. The same plain block letters as the house rules card. The note said, Booth 13, 3:33. Black coffee, cherry pie. Do not look. I read it again. Then I looked at the clock. 3:29. 4 minutes. I stood there for exactly 1 second. Then I moved. The coffee was already made. I poured a cup, black, nothing added, and set it on a small tray. I went to the pie case at the end of the counter, took out a slice of cherry pie, set it on a plate, set the plate on the tray. I checked the clock. 3:31. 2 minutes. I picked up the tray. I had not looked directly at booth 13 all night. I'd redirected every time my eyes moved in that direction, not with any particular effort, just automatically, the way you redirect when you've internalized that looking at something is a bad idea. But now I needed to walk toward it, and that was different. I came around the counter. I moved through the room. The customers I passed did not look up as I went by. They were watching their coffee mugs, their plates, the table in front of them. The room felt stiller than it had a moment ago. Not quieter, the rain was still going, but stiller, like the air had changed quality. I was 6 feet from booth 13 when the woman with the dark, pinned-back hair reached out and took my wrist. Not hard, not grabbing. Her hand closed gently around my wrist, the grip of someone who wants your attention without startling you. I stopped moving. She looked up at me and said quietly, "Can I ask you something?" My brain knew what was happening. Some part of me that had been tracking the clock all night knew exactly what was happening. But her hand was on my wrist, and she was looking up at me, and she had a real face, a tired and human face, and 6 years in restaurants means you stop when someone reaches for you. It's as automatic as pulling your hand back from heat. I stopped. I looked at her. I said, "Yeah." She asked if it was always like this, if they always came through here. She said it softly and without any edge, the way you'd ask about weather patterns, just trying to understand the shape of the place she'd ended up. I told her yes, that from what I understood, this was where they stopped, that the coffee stayed warm and the food was replaced, and there were rules to make sure the stop was what it was supposed to be. She nodded slowly. She let go of my wrist. I looked at the clock. 3:34. I walked to booth 13. I did not look at what was in it. I set the tray down, coffee on the left, pie on the right, straightened up, turned away, and walked back to the counter without looking back. Rule 7 said, "Do not watch." I did not watch. But I had been 1 minute late, and I knew it. And the back of my neck knew it in a way that sat separately from knowing. When I turned to face the room, every customer was watching me. Not all at once. I registered them one by one as my eyes moved across the room. The woman with the purse, the man with his cap flat on the table, the younger man in flannel, the trench coat woman, the family in booth 4, parents fixed and glassy, the boy between them. All of them were looking at me with the same expression. Pity, not horror, not accusation. Pity, the way you look at someone who has done something they couldn't help and everyone in the room already understands the consequence, except them. I looked at the corner without meaning to. The darkness in booth 13 had changed. It was standing. I knew it the way you know something without being able to explain the knowing, not because I could see it clearly or resolve it into details I could describe. The darkness had height to it now. It was more there, more present, more substantial. The way a debt becomes present when a payment is missed. Then it sat back down. I turned away. I gripped the counter edge. I breathed. Eddie's voice came through the pass-through, low and even. "Don't look at it. Keep working. Keep the rules." "I know," I said. "Every rule. Exactly right. The rest of the night." "I know." I went and checked the salt. All full. I replaced a cold plate. I refilled 3 untouched coffees. I moved through the room the way I'd been moving all night, keeping my eyes on the work, keeping the work in front of me. and I did not look at the far corner except insofar as I needed to know where it was. It was in booth 13. It was sitting down. It was not moving toward me. Except, every so often, when I happened to glance the wrong direction, I was aware of the shadow face being oriented my way. Not constantly, not with urgency, just occasionally pointed at me the way a camera catches something in a crowd. And the tapping, one long finger against the tabletop, a slow rhythm I first noticed around 3:50 that I recognized almost immediately and wished I hadn't. It matched my heartbeat exactly. I stopped taking my own pulse mentally. I moved faster. I had things to do. At 3:41, the oldest of the seven, the man with his cap flat on the table, somewhere in his late 70s, face weathered for a long time, looked up from his coffee and said, "Is this the last stop?" I was right beside him, refilling his mug. I had the answer ready the same way I had my own name ready. "For tonight, yes," I said. He nodded. He looked back at his coffee. Something in the set of his face changed. Not visibly dramatic, not something I could point to, but it eased. The way a room eases when someone finally says the thing everyone already knew. He picked up the mug with both hands and drank from it slowly. He didn't need the coffee. I understood that by now. The warmth was the point. The warmth meant he was somewhere for a minute. Present, real, having a cup of coffee at 3:41 in the morning at a diner in Ohio. Wherever he was going, and whatever came after this, right now, he was here. I went back to the counter. By 3:55, the room had settled into a low, steady quiet. The rain on the roof had thinned to a murmur. The jukebox played its slow, nameless song. The customers sat with their coffee and their mostly untouched food. Nobody talking, nobody leaving yet. The only sound I could focus on, if I let myself, was the tap, tap, tap from the far corner. I checked the salt shakers. 4th time in the last hour. They were full. I checked them anyway, moving down the counter and the tables, touching each one, confirming the weight, because it was something concrete, and concrete was what I needed to stay in. At 3:58, I replaced the younger man in flannel's coffee. He looked up when I set the fresh cup down and said quietly, "Thank you." "Of course," I said, the way I'd said it 100 times in 6 years. He went back to looking at the table. At 4 a.m., the clock on the wall ticked over. I stood behind the counter with every salt shaker full and the rain going thin on the roof and my eyes on the second hand moving around the face, and I did not look at the corner of the room. The finger was still tapping. I kept my hands flat on the counter, and I looked at the clock, and I kept the rules, and I waited for whatever came next. The rain thinned to a drizzle somewhere around 4:15, and the diner started emptying the way it had filled, quietly, without announcement, one table at a time. The trenchcoat woman was first. She left sometime between 4 and 4:20 during a stretch where I was behind the counter making coffee and not watching the floor. I looked up and her booth was empty, the mug still on the table, the most recent plate of eggs untouched and cooling. I went and cleared it. The mug, when I picked it up, was still warm. The elderly man with the floating feet left next. I saw him go. He stood up from his stool with the same careful deliberateness he'd used to sit down, set a folded bill on the counter that I didn't pick up until he'd made it to the door, and walked out. I watched him cross the threshold and didn't watch beyond that. Rule 15 was in my head now the way a song gets in your head, not as something I had to consciously recall, but as something that was just there, running in the background. The 2 men in work clothes were gone when I came back from the restroom check at 4:25. Their booth was empty. Their coffee mugs were in the same position as when I'd last refilled them. The salt shaker between them was still full. The room was getting quieter. Not in the way a restaurant gets quiet when the dinner rush is over. That kind of quiet has a looseness to it, an exhale. This was a different quality. Like the volume on something being turned down gradually, by degrees, and you only notice it when you realize how much quieter it is than it was an hour ago. The family in booth 4 was still there. The parents, fixed and glassy as they'd been all night. The boy between them, his second empty hot chocolate mug pushed to the edge of the table. He was leaning against his father's arm with his eyes open, not quite looking at anything. I was refilling the coffee along the remaining counter stools when the voice came from the parking lot. A woman's voice, distressed in the way that makes you move before you've thought about it. High and tight and urgent, the kind of voice that carries the specific signal that something is wrong and needs help right now. I was at the door in 4 steps. My hand was on the push bar. I stopped. I looked through the glass. The parking lot was visible in the thin, gray, pre-dawn murk, the neon sign throwing its red light across the wet asphalt. It was empty. No car, no person. No shape in the fog at the edges of the lot that could have been a woman. The voice came again. "Please," it said. "Please, someone help. I'm hurt. I can't." I stood at the door with my hand on the push bar, and I recited Rule 15 in my head from start to finish. I had it memorized by this point. Every word. Especially the last line. Especially that. I took my hand off the push bar and stepped back. The voice didn't stop. It shifted. Still a woman. Still distressed. But the quality of the distress changed. More specific now. "There's been an accident. Out here, there's been an accident. Someone needs to call." And it cycled through the details in a way that felt designed rather than organic, like it was reading from a list of things that would work. I went back to the counter. I made myself stand with my back to the door and refill the salt shakers that were already full. Then the voice changed to a man's. Calm and urgent, the specific calm, urgent voice of someone who has seen something bad and is controlling themselves. "There's been an accident. There's a child." He said it the way you say something when you want someone to move immediately, and some part of me noted that it was a more sophisticated approach than the distressed woman voice, because a distressed woman in a parking lot at 4:30 in the morning is one thing, but a child in danger is something else. Something that goes past rational decision-making entirely. I gripped the counter edge. I did not move toward the door. Then Eddie's voice came from outside. It said my name. Then it said something was wrong and he needed me to come out for just a second. Just for a second. That was all. I turned and looked through the pass-through. Eddie was at the grill. He had his back to me, working, the way he'd been working all night. He didn't turn around. He didn't know anything had been said. I stood there for a moment looking at the back of his head and the set of his shoulders and the way he moved, steady and unhurried. And then I turned back around and I stared at the open 24-hour sign in the door, and I kept my feet exactly where they were. The voice outside used Eddie's name again. Said he was hurt. Said, "Come quick." I did not move. I refilled the salt shakers. I replaced the cold plates of the older couple who were still in their booth, who had not looked up at anything I'd done in the last 2 hours, who were just there, present, sitting with their cold coffee. I brought them fresh cups. I brought a new slice of toast to the woman with the purse and set it in front of her without comment. The voice outside went through 3 more variations over the next 20 minutes. A car accident on 16. A fire somewhere down the road. A dog hit by a car, which was almost the one that got me, I won't pretend otherwise. I stood at the counter with both hands flat on the surface, and I breathed through it, and I did not go to the door. At 5:10, the family in booth 4 got up to leave. The parents moved together, the way they'd moved all night. In sync, the same pace, not looking at each other, but perfectly coordinated. The boy slid off the bench and stood up and pushed his mug further onto the table in a small automatic tidying gesture. He turned toward the door, and then he turned back, and he looked at me over the counter and he waved. A normal kid's wave, small, shoulder height, the flick of a hand that means goodbye. He smiled the same gap-toothed smile he'd had when he counted his 7 marshmallows. Then he turned and followed his parents to the door, and they walked out, and I watched them cross the threshold, and after that I looked at the counter. Rule 15 was still running in my head. I let it run. It was doing its job. The voice outside had gone quiet somewhere in the last few minutes. I wasn't sure exactly when. At 5:17, the 7 began to leave. Not one at a time, and not all at once. It was harder to describe than that. The woman with the dark, pinned-back hair, The one who had stopped me was there at 5:17, and I could see her clearly at her counter stool, her hands around her mug. By 5:25, she was less there. Not gone, still present, still visibly a person at a stool, but the detail of her had reduced, the way a sound reduces when it's moving away from you. By 5:30, she wasn't there. Not left, not stood up and walked out the way the others had, just less present over the course of minutes, and then not. The same thing happened to the man with the cap, the younger man in flannel, the older couple. One by one they faded out of the room, not through the door, just out, the way a station goes to static when you drive out of range. Their coffee mugs were still on the tables, their untouched food was still on the plates. There was no moment of departure I could point to. There was just the room, gradually emptying of them, until at 5:38 I was standing in a diner with 12 tables, 12 sets of cold, untouched food, 12 coffee mugs, and no one in any of them. I stood behind the counter and looked at the room for a long moment. Then I checked the salt shakers. All full. I went down the counter and checked every one. I went to every table and checked those too. I don't know exactly why. It was the thing I knew how to do. At 5:45, the thing in booth 13 stood up. I saw it in my peripheral vision. I had been watching the clock and I caught the movement at the edge of my field of view, and I kept my eyes on the clock face and did not turn. It was standing. The darkness that had been seated in the far corner all night had height to it now, the same presence it had briefly had after I brought the tribute in 1 minute late. It was oriented, I felt this rather than saw it, toward the front door. The door I had not gone through. The parking lot where the voices had come from. I stood at the counter with my eyes on the clock, and I waited. The second hand went around, then around again. At 5:48, the presence in booth 13 sat back down. The darkness settled, became the familiar, heavy but seated quality it had carried all night. The room felt the same way it had at 3 a.m., before the tribute. The collector in its corner, watching, doing the thing it was here to do, present but contained. I exhaled. My hands were shaking very slightly. I hadn't noticed until just then. I put them flat on the counter and pressed down until they stopped. The tribute had been 1 minute late. Whatever that cost, whatever entry had been made in a ledger I'd never see, it had been noted and set aside. For now. The "for now" was sitting in the room with me, but it was sitting down, and that was all I could ask for. At 5:58, the back door opened. Mabel came in. Silver hair, rhinestone cat eyes, the same pale blue uniform. She looked at the room the way someone looks at a thing they've looked at many times before and are checking for specific differences. Her eyes moved from table to table, counting the cold plates, the full mugs, the empty seats. She came around behind the counter and stood next to me and looked at the room some more. "You followed the rules," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was late with booth 13, I said. 1 minute, 3:34 instead of 3:33. Someone stopped me." She looked at me sideways over the rhinestone frames. "I stopped," I said. She asked me something and I stopped and answered her. Mabel looked at the room for a moment. Then she said, "All right." The way a doctor says it when the test results are back and the news is what it is. Not good, not bad, just conclusive. She picked up a rag from under the counter and began wiping things down. That was all. No further questions. No explanation of what the 1 minute meant, or what the ledger entry said, or what came next. I stood there for a moment. Then I took off my apron. I folded it and set it on the counter. The laminated card was in the pocket. I took it out and set it on top of the folded apron, and I looked at it for a second. All 15 rules, plain font, the note at the bottom about termination and consequences beyond management's control. And I left it there. I walked to the front door and pushed it open. The air outside was cold and damp and smelled like wet asphalt and forest. The fog was still over Route 16 in both directions, but thinner now, the way fog gets when the light is coming even before the light actually arrives. The neon sign above me still pulsed. The last stop. The V still going in and out. My car was on the shoulder where I'd left it. I got in. I put the key in the ignition and sat there with my hand on it for a second, thinking about all the reasons it shouldn't start. It started. I pulled out onto Route 16 and I drove east, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. I didn't call in for the next shift. I drove to Columbus and slept for 11 hours in a motel off I-70, and when I woke up, I lay there on the ceiling for a long time before I got up. In the weeks after, I went through the motions, applied for jobs, bought groceries, talked to people, moved through days, with the flatness of someone routing around something they're not ready to process directly. I didn't talk about the last stop. There wasn't a version of the explanation that ended well. I made my own rules. Not the ones from the card, which I'd left on the counter and meant it. Mine were simpler, worked out from what I'd seen. Never follow anyone into a parking lot you can't see clearly. Leave dropped things 7 minutes. Keep the salt full. Let the phone ring 3 times before you decide whether to answer. I don't know if they work anywhere but that quarter-mile stretch of fog on Route 16. I follow them anyway. I don't know what the last stop is. I don't know what sat in booth 13 or what it wrote in its ledger when the tribute came in a minute late. I know the tribute was late because I stopped for a dead woman's question, and I know I'd probably stop again, which is the part I can't resolve. I keep rules now. They're on a note card in my wallet. Not because I plan to go back. I take interstates. I avoid state routes. I don't stop at diners I can't see from the main road. But thin places are everywhere. I know that now. If you find one, take the job if you have to. Read the card. Follow every rule, all night. And don't follow anyone into the parking lot. Nobody ever forgot anything worth your life.